Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Megzy. I know it has been a while, but today is the day I will be doing my January wrap up. I read a total of 5 books in January. Not the best, but could have been worse. And let's see, we have them here. Some book bin finds. So, of those 5 books, I read one translation from Arabic into English. I read some books about revolutionary politics, critiques of capitalism, a good analysis of our modern political crisis with conspiracy theories, and a classic by Toni Morrison. So if any of those sound interesting to you, please stick around, hit the like button, subscribe, and we will get into it. So the first book I read was B as in Beirut by Iman Younes. Hope that's how you say her name. Translated by Max Weiss. This is a translation from Arabic into English. It is about the Lebanese Civil War, which happened from 1975 to 1990. And it's split up into 4 different sections, and it follows 4 different women living in the same apartment building in Beirut. The time period is towards more of the end of the Civil War. You get the sense it is more in the late 80s as this is occurring. And as it follows these 4 women, it is a really good picture of how people adapt and just end up doing everyday, mundane day-to-day tasks, living under this violent backdrop of war. How does war become your new normal? Because I think a lot of times when we talk about war, we think of it more in the abstract and not how everyday people live with all of this violence and uncertainty that is going on around you. How do you adapt to trying to prepare meals while you're also running to the bomb shelter, or your neighbors are suddenly there one day and they're gone the next, or you're losing family members either physically or mentally. There's explosions happening all the time. I think it's a pretty good portrait of that. You don't have to know a whole lot about the Lebanese Civil War, I think, to appreciate and understand this book. The details of that are not essential to reading and understanding this. Of the 4 stories in the book, as I said, it follows 4 different women. I thought the last 2 in the book were the strongest. And the sections are broken up by their names. So the second last story follows a woman named Camilla, and then the last story follows a woman named Maha. Camilla is a Lebanese woman. She leaves Lebanon, goes to Europe during the Civil War, and then she comes back and tries to create a documentary with some other people. And she ends up becoming entangled by having relationships with 2 different men there, with a doctor and then also this militiaman. And then we have Maha, who is her neighbor in the apartment building. Camilla ends up living with Maha, and towards the end, we see that they're all living with this random militiaman, and these random militia types are like going in and out of their apartment as this is happening. In my opinion, I thought like these 2 stories were the most interconnected out of all of the stories. And Maha and Camilla at the end, right as this book is ending, we see the ending leading up to the end of the war. They end up having to band together, even though neither of them, particularly Maha, doesn't quite trust Camilla. I thought I would actually read some excerpts that I thought were a pretty good indication of just the new normal and what it is like to live under war. And let's see, some things I highlighted. That's war, my friend, the most despicable way of disagreeing. Did we really need all that violence? Another good quote. All cities look the same. They look the same in times of peace, and they look the same in times of war. There are statues back there, like the statues over here. They died so that Lebanon might live, I read under one of the posters pasted to the wall. I translated what I read for Ibrahim, who commented drowsily, "They died, but Lebanon still didn't live." Some dark humor, I think, always helps. And then this is from Maha's story. The sounds of the explosions blended with the sound of the rain. I had a greater tolerance for the sounds when the rain was falling, as if the explosions got wet in the rain, grew softer, and became less harsh on the walls of the houses and their inhabitants. Even violence reaches a point from which it cannot advance further. It will go on piling up on the violence that came before it, stacking up time and emptiness. It becomes like bare, unembellished lust. I think overall, in terms of the translation, I thought this was a pretty good job. When you're reading this, you don't get the sense that this was a translation. I have read translations where that is the case, where it felt a little bit clunky. And if I didn't know any better, I would have thought that this was actually originally written in English. So the translator did a good job. And that is no small feat because Arabic is very different from English and vice versa. So, yes, if you are interested in any kind of Lebanese literature, this is published by, I think, Interlink Books, which I believe is like an Arab American owned publishing group in Northampton, Massachusetts. I would recommend check it out. I thought it wasn't bad. If you can stomach it, again, it's about war, so it's not going to be freaking cheery and uplifting. Although I have read more disturbing, but yeah, I would give it 4 stars out of 5. So the next book I read was My Revolutions by Hari Kunzru. This was interesting to read, specifically now in this current political climate. The book was published in 2007, but it switches back and forth between the present in the book is the 1990s, and the main character's youth, his heyday, was in the late 60s, early 70s. So it's about a man named Chris Carver, who is this former left-wing radical who was involved in this like anarchist communist group that was involved in terrorism plots in the 70s. They didn't start out that way. They did start out genuinely trying to help people, house the homeless, stage protests, sit-ins, things like that. And gradually, over the course of the book, as we switch back and forth from the 70s to the 90s, we see how this group becomes more and more extreme to plotting to just blow things up. And so the main character, Chris, is in the 1990s. He is living under a different identity because he was on the run as the feds were closing in. And so he is now on the eve of his 50th birthday. He is haunted by figures from his past, both literally by a kind of frenemy that reappears and threatens to blackmail him, involved with this like whole thing with this female politician because they're trying to dig up dirt on her and she's connected to his former group. And also sort of like figuratively, he sees what he thinks is his former love interest on vacation, and he like becomes obsessed with like trying to track her down. I mean, this book, I think in some people, like there is aspects about this book that sound kind of familiar. I definitely have heard this sort of trope of I was a former radical in the 60s and 70s, and then I turned complacent, work within the machine, man, But I thought that, irregardless of that, I do think that the book is a pretty interesting plot. The main character is kind of insufferable, not just as like an older man, but as a young guy, he is annoying to me. And I guess I just wasn't quite sure what the plot, or like not what the plot. I wasn't really sure like what the message of this book was. I genuinely was not sure if this book was like anti-communist or anti-capitalist, or maybe both. This character, like even when he's a young man, he doesn't really have like a real ideology, even though he becomes swept up into this group. Like we understand, and the group is alluded to like following the principles of like Marxist Leninism, Maoism. Please don't ask me how to define all those different ideologies. It's not because I don't even think the character Chris knows. He just has this like vague sense of what is right and just. And so he gets involved in this group or funneled into it because he initially, as a young man in the UK, is protesting the Vietnam War. And he also becomes obsessed with this woman, Anna, who is the woman that haunts him when he's older. And sort of, I think the thing that frustrated me a little bit about this book was that it reminded me a little of Philip Roth's American Pastoral, which is definitely anti-communist. And you get the sense in both books that what is being said is people become attracted to ideologies like communism or socialism because they have individual family problems and they're trying to find some kind of belonging in a group, or they're just chasing like someone within that group like a lust object. And not because maybe these people have seen the horrors of capitalism or terrorism that the state is conducting on a massive scale at home and abroad. It's always like, oh, it's some psychological problem with you. And I think that annoyed me because I felt like that was slightly a conservative take. However, I do think that the book does, I think, serve as a good warning as to groupthink and how any kind of political ideology, no matter where it falls on the spectrum, can become culty and can lead to psychological abuse. And that is how the main character, when he's a young man, he becomes so swept up into this because there is like a great deal of just like psychological warfare that the people who are at the higher ups, the top, even though they're supposed to be all equal, right? Including this woman, Anna, she sits at the top as they kind of like psychologically abuse and use like psychological warfare against the other members. So overall, I thought the book was good. I thought it did give me a lot to think about. Personally, I kind of feel like in this day and age, we need a little bit of more revolutionary politics, or at least more radical politics. But hope it doesn't get me censored on YouTube. Overall, I thought it was decent, 4 stars, even if there were points I personally like politically disagreed with. It is briefly based, FYI, for people who don't know, this group is supposed to be based off of a group called the Angry Brigade in the UK. As an American, I was reading this and I thought of the Weather Underground, but there was an author's note at the end about this. So yeah, not bad. Gives you something to think about. But yeah, the complacent 90s, man. Kind of feel like that's what led us to this point in history, right? Yeah, so not bad. 4 stars. So the next book I read was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This is a very old mass market paperback version that I found in a book bin. And I've wanted to read this book for a bit. I have read 2 Toni Morrison books before. One was Beloved and the other was Song of Solomon. I had to read these in college years ago. And after reading this book, I feel like I'm not sure. Like, I can acknowledge Toni Morrison's talent, but I don't know if I really like enjoy reading her work. This book was different than what I thought. It was very, very heavy-handed. It was very bleak. And I felt like she kind of kept like hitting you over the head with metaphors and just like, like kicking you with just all of this, like, it was a lot. So it wasn't pleasant to read. I guess that is the point. I think what I thought this book would be about was more about like whiteness and white beauty standards and how that impacts African American girls. And yeah, that is there. But a lot of this is more about like childhood sexual abuse, intergenerational trauma, respectability politics, the idealized like mid 20th century white suburban family picture, and how for all these systemic reasons African Americans generally did not have that. So anyway, the whole plot of this, it follows a young girl named Piccola. I think that's how it's pronounced. And we flit around between so many different perspectives. I mean, this book is very short. This is like a very short yellowed version I have. So it was typeset in like very tiny font. But we don't ever really like follow the main character Piccola's perspective. We follow like so many other perspectives, like the family she's like staying with at this boarding house, and her mother's perspective, her father's perspective, this weirdo like pedophile preacher guy we follow at the end. And Piccola is so victimized and just has this horrid life. And I felt like you really feel that victimization because she's always like an outsider to you. You never get like her own experience. And so I think that makes it even more uncomfortable because you always see this poor girl as this eternal victim of abuse. There were some things that I thought were well done. I really enjoyed when we follow the mother's perspective when she's a young woman and how she started going to the movies as this form of escapism and how she developed these very destructive ideals about romantic love and beauty standards and how she would like even do up her hair trying to imitate the old Hollywood movie stars. I really enjoyed that section, and I've actually seen that section excerpted before in other works. I want to actually read some of that. In the movies, there in the dark, her memory was refreshed, and she succumbed to her earlier dreams. Along with the idea of romantic love, she was introduced to another, physical beauty, probably the most destructive ideas in the history of human thought. Both originated in envy, thrived in insecurity, and ended in disillusion. In equating physical beauty with virtue, she stripped her mind, bound it, and collected self-contempt by the heap. Again, this is Toni Morrison's first book, and so I think you can see the making of someone who is very talented, but the entire book doesn't quite land like that for me. Towards the end, with the weird pedophile guy who bestows Piccola with her wish of blue eyes, there was this really weird clunkiness to comparing being a homosexual to being a pedophile. And I understand this book was written in the 1970s, but we can see now how like that belief is so harmful because it's still like perpetuated, right? And yeah, again, if I could describe one word for this book, it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. It's not pleasant. So yeah, just be warned, it is not really so much about beauty standards and whiteness and proximity to whiteness. It is much more about trauma and childhood sexual abuse more than anything. So trigger warning on that. I would give it 3 stars. Again, I still do want to read Toni Morrison's work because I'm like still looking for something that like really lands for me. But as of yet, I haven't quite found it. So 3 stars for me. The next book I read was Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative by Mark Fisher. This is, I guess, kind of like an indie book cult classic. It has been referenced so many times. I did not realize, though, how much this book appropriates from other authors, namely, I'm going to butcher this guy's name, Slavoj Zizek. The quote that I thought was from this book, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism," comes from Zizek. And Zizek is, as I mentioned, so heavily referenced in this book. And then to have like a quote by him on the back cover praising it seems a little bit self-serving. I think I thought this book would be, again, kind of like The Bluest Eye, something else. It is very, very dense and academic, and I don't even know if I could easily summarize it to the way that I want, because I probably should have been taking notes when I was reading it. And even though I have a booktube, that's just like not what I want to do. That takes the fun out of reading. But basically, this book is essentially illuminating how much life under capitalism, specifically neoliberal capitalism, has infected every point of our lives, not just in how we work, but it's infiltrated every aspect of academia and how healthcare and our mental health. And he's really good, I think, at like pointing out problems, and but yet I don't really find that this book really gave a lot of solutions, and that to me was very depressing. And I think that it's more frustrating to read this in 2025. It was published in 2009, and there was so much that happened even in the years after 2009. I mean, I'm not sure when he was writing this if the big economic recession happened yet. I probably not. I don't, when it was published versus when it was written is different. And then, of course, Occupy Wall Street and Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016 and Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. And then, of course, you see the rise of like right-wing fascist types like Trump and Bolsonaro and the woman in Italy, I forget her name, and Orban in Hungary and all these other types. And so definitely it is good, like I said, at illuminating how everything about our lives is run in this sort of like corporate bureaucracy. But like I said, I think it just doesn't offer enough solutions, and that's what's frustrating to me. Like I think that more people than ever, well, at least a lot of millennials and Gen Z are aware that there's a crisis in capitalism. But the answer is, what is the solution to all of this? Revolution? According to Harry Kunzru, you don't want to do that. So I think that for me was just why reading it, other than like the dense, heavy academic jargon and constant referencing of other authors, didn't quite make it satisfying. There are some good lines in this, but yeah, it's just like, it's okay. I don't know. It's just not accessible, and yeah. So I rated it 3 stars. Mark Fisher is no longer with us anymore, and I definitely got the sense from reading this book, I could tell he suffered from depression. So yeah, unfortunately. And the last and final book I read in January was Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, A Trip into the Mirror World. So this is a nonfiction exploration that basically explores modern conspiracy theories and how people fall into them. And Klein's entry point into this is another author that she has frequently throughout her entire career been mistaken for, Naomi Wolf. Now, both Naomi Wolf and Naomi Klein are two middle-aged white Jewish women who came to prominence in the 1990s when they published their first books. Naomi Wolf wrote The Beauty Myth, which I own, and Naomi Klein, her first book was No Logo. Naomi Wolf was more of a liberal feminist. She was definitely part of like the Democratic Party establishment. She worked on Al Gore's campaign. And Naomi Klein has always been more of like a socialist type. She's always analyzed power systems at B and critiqued capitalism and the military industrial complex and, climate catastrophe, all of that. And so within the past decade, Naomi Wolf has gone more and more off the rails into right-wing conspiracy theories. This is a former liberal feminist that began to regularly appear within the past couple of years on Steve Bannon's show. And Naomi Klein frequently has been mistaken for her. And initially it bothered her. And so, but instead of feeling bothered, she decided to explore what happened to Naomi Wolf. And by extension, what is happening to the world? Why are people falling for these insane conspiracy theories? And I think it's interesting to note, and this was sort of like a paraphrasing of Angela Davis's review of the book on the back of the cover, was how a lot of times conspiracies in general can sometimes be like these weird, distorted misinterpretations of like leftist critiques, and yet they're somehow distorted into like, there's a kernel of truth that's like true, and yet they're like completely thrown off the rails. And I feel like a really good example of that, if you can find it on YouTube, is like a conversation in the 1990s between Alex Jones and Noam Chomsky. And you will see how Alex Jones agrees with a lot of what Noam Chomsky is saying, and yet he goes off the rails and arrives to like these insane like conclusions that just make no sense. And so Anyway, this whole book is a pretty good exploration of like what is happening to a lot of people, and especially how a lot of people kind of lost their minds during COVID. But in general, I thought the book was pretty good. I thought it was pretty fascinating. I do enjoy Klein's writing. I think she's a pretty good storyteller and really good also at providing the reader with a lot of pertinent information and also relevant history. But I do think in general, it did feel like it was kind of tied together in a very loose way and kind of shoehorned into this like doppelganger theme. She talks a lot too in general what she calls the mirror world, and how kind of that old cliche of like those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, and how in recent years there's sort of been this bubbling up of past histories and past injustices that I think a lot of the Western world has not really come to terms with our own like colonial history. And another thing I thought what was interesting was she covers the Nazis as well as Zionism. And one of the things I think that I remember that stuck with me was how Hitler was not this unique aberration within Western history. A lot of the Nazis' ideas were taken from the United States with Manifest Destiny, with Jim Crow laws, with gasoline baths at the border of Mexican immigrants. And so these events just all kind of feed on each other. I enjoy Klein, like I said. I think she's a good writer. I think she has written a lot of really necessary, intelligent works. But yet I do sometimes feel like down when I read her work. I felt this way when I read The Shock Doctrine. And I kind of felt that way when I read this book. This book was published in 2023, and I think it would have been so interesting had this like been published just a little bit later in light of Gaza and in light of Trump's reelection. But yeah, if you have friends or family that went off the deep end, I recommend it. I do think it is a pretty good analysis of conspiracy theories and political polarization, and how we all have to like confront dark history. We can't just see these terrible events in the past as just singular moments in time. They're all evolving and interconnected. And I think Ta-Nehisi Coates also really, he mentioned this in the message of how like history is always, it's always interconnected. So yeah, I thought it was pretty good, if not still a little bit disjointed and shoehorned at times, and I would rate it 4 stars. So that is it. Those are all the books I read in January. A lot of them were downers, and I will admit I think it's been affecting my mood because it is dark, it is gloomy, there was a lot of stuff going on in the world that is not good. So my goal for February, other than the books I have already read, is to read some things a little more light, a little more cheery. I'm tired of reading nihilism. So yeah, that's it. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like, a thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.